And now, straight out of Boston, Massachusetts, it's time for Entertainment Talk Nation, your number one entertainment talk show, discussing everything from the movies to video games and more. And now, here is your host, Robert Rosado.
Good Monday, everybody. Welcome to the E.T.N. podcast. I am Rob. Wonderful. I hope everybody had a great weekend. And this podcast episode, we're going to be doing the Godzilla 1954 deep dive. We're going to talk a lot about the movie. It's not going to be a review. I'm going to discuss parts about the movie that I thought were incredible, talk about the actors, just a deep look into one of the most iconic kaiju movies ever made. And Godzilla 1954 was obviously remade for U.S. audiences, starring Raymond Burr. And this movie is still to this day, first of all, holds very well. And when you look at this movie compared to all the other Godzilla movies to follow, this still to me stands to be the best movie. I'm a huge Return of Godzilla fan, or Godzilla 1985 for those who are familiar. Or aren't familiar, I should say. But this one is the one. It has a very good story. It even has a romantic triangle within the story, within the plot, a small subplot, which somehow, some way works very well into the movie. And when you look at a lot of kaiju movies, this is an element that's either lost or doesn't exist, or is very cheesy. And few and far between. Godzilla 1954 was not the first Godzilla movie I ever saw. My first movie was Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, and that is another movie we're going to do on the deep dive, maybe next Monday. We're going to be doing these once a week. We're not going to do every Godzilla movie ever. We're only going to take the ones that I felt, in my opinion, were some of the better ones, from obviously the Showa era, going all the way up to the legendary era. The movie stars Akira Takarada, Momoko Koichi, Ashiko Harada. Three very, very good actors, not only because of their kaiju presence, because Takarada and Harada each were in 8 Godzilla movies, or 8 Toho movies, I should say. They weren't all Godzilla movies, because they weren't also in movies like Rodan and Mothra. Takarada is still active in Japanese movies. He did a movie last August 2019 called Dance With Me. Very popular with Toho was Akira Takarada, mainly for his good looks and his acting, according to reports. He was actually born in Korea when it was occupied by Japan. As I mentioned, he was in 8 Godzilla films, with the last one, technically the last one being Godzilla Final Wars, but he was in a deleted scene in Godzilla 2014. A scene that was, once people learned that it was deleted, were pretty upset about it. But another thing that I didn't know, and this is very interesting, but Takarada is also Japan's Jafar. He does the voice of the popular villain from the Aladdin series for the Japanese version of anything Aladdin, and he reprised the role many times. Obviously, all the Aladdin movies where Jafar is present. Also, if you're familiar with the Kingdom Heart games, which is a collaborated effort by Japan's Squaresoft and Disney, Takarada on the Japanese end for the game does the voice of Jafar as well. He also does the voice at the Disneyland attraction in Tokyo for Henry from the Country Bear Jamboree. Pretty interesting. He also did the Japanese voice for Bendu from Star Wars Rebels in Season 3. And it was the voice of Radagon from Disney's The Great Mouse Detective. So Takarada has had an illustrious career and still doing, and he's very energetic. I mean, he's in a lot of you go to most of the kaiju related conventions, and Takarada is present. He also had a cameo in Billy Dubos's Godzilla Battle Royale, which we covered on this channel a couple of years back when he released it. A very fun fanfic. And if you've seen it, you know that Billy put a lot of effort into that. It was a fantastic fun ride. So Takarada is and 85 years old, still very active, and not only in conventions but also on the screen. Most of his roles now are more cameo, but still very, very, very active. So God bless him, and he's very popular here in America for his presence in the kaiju genre. But he's had a very illustrious career beyond Toho kaiju movies. Momoko Koichi, who unfortunately passed away in 1998 at 66 due to colon cancer, was only ever in 2 Godzilla movies. Obviously, 1954, where she played Emiko, and then she reprised the role in 1995 for Godzilla vs. Destroyer. She was very young and inexperienced during her role for Godzilla 1954, but Ishiro Honda thought she had a lot of talent and wanted to bring her on. She had a very successful movie career as well as on TV, as she was in 9 different TV series dating from 1962 to just a year before her death in 1997. So another actress who, while not in many Toho films, was very prominent in Japanese film and TV. Then we have Kahiko Harada, who plays the infamous Dr. Serizawa, was also in 8 Toho films, but he was actually best known in Japan for his work in the Samurai trilogy, and mostly as playing Daisuke Serizawa in Godzilla 1954. He was also born in Seoul, Korea, graduated from Tokyo University. He was actually he graduated with an interior design degree. Interesting. And he started in the film industry as an assistant director under his older brother. He passed away in 1984, unfortunately, due to lung cancer. He was actually supposed to play the role of Professor Makoto Hiyashida in Godzilla Returns. And because of his illness, the role was eventually given to Yosuke Natsuki. And Natsuki was also his co-star, Hirata's co-star, in Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster. His last movie was Sayonara Jupiter in 1984, and he was 56 when he passed away. So these are the 3 core actors in this movie, and all give a great performance. This was in the early part of their career, and you could argue that Godzilla 1954 launched their career, because they all 3 of them gave great performances. To be able to convey the kind of story they did, and also successfully make a love triangle work in a kaiju movie, which, let's be honest, how often do you see that now? Or ever? I mean, even in Cloverfield, the whole purpose was to find Rob's girlfriend, Beth. That was the whole premise of that story, outside of the monster, was Rob and Beth having an issue with him leaving and her finding a new boyfriend. And then the monster attacks, and Rob wants to find his love. But it's not as compelling. So God bless them for not only great performances, but also very convincing and good writing as well. I mean, let's not take that away. Excellent writing when you consider that a love triangle, first of all, love triangles barely work in any movie, let alone a kaiju movie, but it works here. And that's one of the things you don't hear people talk about too much when it comes to Godzilla 1954. You don't hear them praise the love triangle, but it deserves praise. It deserves praise because it works. Now, Godzilla 1954 obviously if you go back and you look at my 30 for 30 series, I started the series talking about 1954 and the inspiration behind it. As we all know, that it wasn't necessarily the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because that happened about 10 years earlier. But it happened because of a fishing vessel that went out to obviously do fishing during a time that the United States was going to do a nuclear test, which I believe was Castle Bravo, in which the explosion of the nuclear bomb actually, the effects of it were further than the Americans anticipated. At the time that it happened, the fishing vessel, Lucky Dragon 5, which like I said, I spoke about in my 30 for 30, was the inspiration. And the men witnessed the bomb. It was far enough, obviously, that it wouldn't incinerate them, but they saw the flash, the ashes came down, and initially they didn't feel anything. It wasn't until much later, on their way back to port, that they started feeling illnesses. They started getting reactions. By the time this started happening, there were actually some portions of the fish that they caught that made it out to the market. But for the most part, this almost tanked the fishing market during that time. This was what inspired Godzilla 1954. As you see the opening of the movie, pretty much almost, not moment for moment, but more or less reenacts what happened. And what's amazing is when you think about Godzilla 1954, we often talk about why other companies, why other production companies or other creators or other studios cannot either A, make a good kaiju film, or design a kaiju that's just as cool looking as Godzilla. But what we fail, I think, to realize, and I'm just as guilty about this, is the fact that Godzilla was envisioned and inspired by nuclear tragedy. When you make something in the form of art that's inspired by real life, whether it be tragedy or anything else, that usually hits home. That usually turns into success, because it represents something that's actually happened. It represents something that the artist has actually experienced or traumatized, or has seen other people traumatized by it, or seen other people experience. And I think that's why Godzilla to this day remains such a unique fictional character. I think that's why to this day he remains such a unique design, because a lot of other kaiju movies are not necessarily inspired by a similar tragedy. A lot of other kaiju movies, and I'm talking post Godzilla 1954, not necessarily before that, because we know before that there were obviously other creations that are original into their own. But there's a lot inspired by Godzilla that came later. But if you look at it, a lot of it's inspired through more of his later movies, because it's really hard to duplicate what 1954 did. Because if you weren't there at the moment, if you weren't taking in the tragedy as it happened and how it affected the country, how it affected people, there's no way you could ever duplicate that on screen, no matter how hard you try. It's just not going to happen. And that's what makes the movie, to this day, one of the best movies ever. I'm going to take a moment here. I want to, and there'll be a cut in the video and in the podcast, because I want to play a clip from a video I did many years ago with my mother. My mother saw the original 1954 movie. And this little clip, it's a very small audio clip that I'll put in, where she expresses how scared she was when she first saw this movie. So give me a moment while I pull it up. Okay, so here is a clip of my mother talking about her experience watching Godzilla 1954 for the first time. And just so you know, she gives clarity that she didn't see it the year it came out because she was still very young, but she saw it sometime later, and that didn't seem to make a difference. Here we go.
1954. I was a very young girl at the time. I was I was young, about 5, 6. But when they made it in 1954, I didn't see it until I was much older.
Right.
But the first time I saw it, I was really scared.
Yeah.
It was something I never seen before. So I was really scared. Really, I had nightmares.
And there you have it. And it is a scary movie. Now it doesn't maybe scare us, and we'll probably never have the experience someone my mother had, and other people who saw the movie at the time it came out, because obviously special effects have changed, and while the movie has aged well for many reasons, obviously you can look at it now compared to what we see presently, and there's a significant difference. But at the time, this was state of the art, special effects. This was the best of the best. And even then, when you look at this movie, it is scary. One of the parts that I always talk about when I talk about how scary it is and how crazy it can get is the scene with the mother and her children. When she tells her children that they'll be with their father soon. I mean, can you imagine that? Can you imagine I can't. Having kids, I couldn't imagine having to break to them that they're going to die. That would be the worst thing that I would want to take to my grave. And again, this is just another thing about this movie that makes it so incredible. That to me makes it the best kaiju movie ever created, because it can't be duplicated. You don't want to duplicate the experience that it took to garner this expression of art. No country, whether it be America, whether it be any other country in the world, will ever have their own Godzilla, because they will never experience what the people in Japan experienced all those years ago. And I think that's the answer to the question that many of us have. Because as a content creator for the last 5 years, with a heavy focus on Godzilla, I have received many questions as to, do you think America can have their own Godzilla? Do you think so-and-so can? And no, I don't. I don't, because no other country in the world has ever experienced what was experienced in Hiroshima, in Nagasaki, to the Lucky Dragon 5. And because of that, they will never understand what it took to the tragedy that it took, the trauma that it took to create such a creature that represents that tragedy. And that's what makes 1954 such a special film. Because it serves as a reminder in so many different ways. It serves as a reminder to the art behind creating such a creature. It serves as a reminder of what it took to get to there. Or to get there, I should say. Tragedy. It serves as a reminder to what us as humans are capable of when it comes to destroying ourselves. As a reminder to the destruction level of nuclear warfare, of weapons of mass destruction. And what's scary is today's bombs are much more severe, are much larger than the bombs dropped in the country that back in the 1940s. So there's so many things about Godzilla from 1954 that make it such a unique, a special, and an incredible movie. And there are some iconic parts in this movie. When you look at any documentary, or you look at any or video on YouTube, whatever, when they talk about this movie, when they talk about some of the parts, Godzilla coming over the hill looking down at the people is one of the most iconic parts. There are scenes in this movie that are just dreadful to look at. When he incinerates Boston. I'm thinking about Godzilla King of the Monsters. Sorry. When he's attacking Tokyo and the sheer amount of damage, there's a scene where they pan back and the whole city is up in flames. The destruction level of this movie, I think, is underestimated compared to some of his other movies. But when you look at this movie and go look at all the other Godzilla movies, there's not many movies that match the level of destruction that Godzilla causes in this movie. Return of Godzilla, a little bit. But a lot of the verse movies, you do not see this level of destruction. And it's also not portrayed as realistically as it is in Godzilla 1954, even though this movie is old. I think about a movie like Godzilla vs. Destroyer, where Godzilla and Destroyer, I mean, they're doing a number on each other, and the city's being wrecked. But even still, even with that, I look at that, and there's just nothing about that is nearly as disturbing as what I see in Godzilla 1954. And this is, again, why this is one of the best. As much as I love Godzilla 2014 and the Legendary movies, as much as I love a good portion of the Heisei series, this movie, there are still things that are done in this movie that other movies can't compare to. Other Godzilla movies cannot compare to. Other Kaiju movies cannot compare to. The sirens. You know, you look at some of the current or some of the later Godzilla movies. Every time he's coming to Tokyo or wherever, he's coming to Japan and he's ready to wreak havoc, you'll hear the newscast go public, PA system, right? You know, and they say Godzilla is on his way and blah, 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 and make sure you evacuate, and you see people running. Every now and then you'll get that siren. But this, again, it's the way the siren sounds in 54 and the fact that not everybody makes it out. It is those small details that add to that fear factor that in some ways I wish I could understand how my mom felt watching it. Because even though I know now watching it, and even when I watched it as a kid, it being, you know, again, when I say dated, I don't mean it doesn't hold up. I still think it holds up, but dated in terms of you can tell now watching it much easier. I mean, we all know it's obviously fake and pretend, you know, we all know that. But you can tell watching it, it doesn't look nearly as real as it must have looked back when it first came out. And even then, you can still understand that dread. You could still understand the despair that it makes you feel knowing that there's no hope for these people in the movie. There is no hope for the city, and that there's nothing they can do to stop this creature. They're at the mercy of Godzilla throughout the whole movie until Dr. Serizawa makes that sacrifice. And this is where we also understand the other messaging in this movie, which is that Serizawa knows that what he has to do, yes, it will save the city, it will save the country, it will save the people, but it only opens the door for others to take his creation and use it for evil. Because as humans, we can't help ourselves. Even now, nuclear power. Nuclear power is the cleanest amongst generating energy. Nuclear power can do a lot of good. Much like Dr. Serizawa's oxygen destroyer could do much good in terms of stopping this creature. But he also knows, as many of us do, that human nature cannot help itself. And while his oxygen destroyer is capable of saving millions, as us as humans generate clean energy with nuclear power, we can turn around and use it to bomb another country. And Dr. Serizawa in the movie knows that human nature can use his technology to turn around and fashion it as a weapon against others. The other thing about this movie that I remember could be seen as a very dreadful look is the many times in the movie where it's almost like Godzilla's hovering. When I mean that is like when he's in the river and he's coming up and he's going down, and like a tease, you know? It's almost like a foreboding that you know he's gonna make landfall. It's just a matter of when. And even after his path of destruction, he still doesn't leave. I mean, when Serizawa goes into the water, he's just hanging out there sleeping. Forever tormenting. Another thing that we've never seen from a Godzilla movie, or even, you know, from that point forward. You know, he always arrives and then he always leaves. He always arrives and he always leaves. In this movie, he arrives and he never leaves. Think about that. He never leaves. Even after his path of destruction, he does not leave. These are, again, those small details about this movie. The little things about this movie that make it so good. The acting, so good. The story, incredible. The lore that they build up for Godzilla, which obviously would change much later on, but even the initial lore is so good. The director, Ishiro Honda, the amazing thing about this, he is full of fortune. This man who obviously passed away a long time ago. But one thing I learned when looking up this movie's history a long time ago, I didn't talk about this on the 30 for 30 series because I wanted to focus on the movie. But here in this deep dive, Ishiro Honda saw a lot of warfare. Well, I don't want to say a lot of warfare, but he had been lucky many times in his life leading up to his career. He was drafted many times. And one of the stories is that he got drafted. He was supposed to go get on a ship that was supposed to take him and the group that he was part of, the platoon he was part of. I'll use that. They have a different word for it in Japanese, but they were supposed to go to the Pacific, which, if you're aware, with World War II, the Pacific portion of that war was probably the most violent between America and Japan. And he was supposed to be in that part of the war. His platoon ended up being late for the boat and they missed it. So he got taken to a site in China, his platoon, where there wasn't really much war going on. However, even while there, he had been out with his platoon and there was a mortar fired at the group. It landed right in front of him. Never went off. Never went off. Had it gone off, he would have been dead. And this is not the first time things like that have happened to him. So obviously he has some experience with seeing war and destruction. So when you have a director like that who has his own experiences and was there during the time that obviously the bombs dropped and things like that, you have somebody that was right there. So you're looking at a director who really took some of his experience, the trauma, his own trauma, along with the trauma of others, as well as just looking at the country during this time. And then you have, again, the story about the Lucky Dragon 5. All these elements, plus the talents and the expression of the actors, the director, the writers, all this is what created Godzilla 1954. And this is why you will never see a kaiju movie like it ever again. And this is why you will never see a monster like Godzilla created by anyone else. Because the only way you could have a chance to do that, as I said earlier, is to duplicate the experience. And let's face it, that's not an experience you want to duplicate. Even Japan in and of itself could not recapture that in Shin Gojira. For all the merits that the movie got, for all the praise that it got and the awards, it still, in my opinion, doesn't match 54. Because while you had a very different Godzilla, while you had a very different story, the story was not nearly as personal. It wasn't nearly as personal. And I'm not here trying to knock Shin Gojira again. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is tell you what the differences are. I accept the fact that it's a world-renowned movie amongst many fans and won all the awards. I'm not taking that away at all. And the only thing I did not like about the movie, as I've said many times, is it was a little bit too much government satire for my taste. It just doesn't have the heart and the emotion that Godzilla 1954 has. That's really what Shin Gojira lacks. And I think perhaps if it had some of that, I would put it up there amongst some of the best Godzilla movies. But it doesn't have that. It doesn't have that personal touch that Godzilla 54 has when you look at characters like, Serizawa and Emiko and Ogara. Oh, excuse me, I said the name wrong. I'm bad at pronouncing names in the first place and then having to say them during but Ogata is what I should have said. Those three characters, that core, that trifecta is what delivers in this movie, along with the terror of Godzilla and why he's there, what he represents. These are elements that are just, in some way, tragically, was the perfect formula, was the perfect recipe to put this movie together. And it's not, I'm sure if they had to go back and do it again, they wouldn't want to experience that. And they would rather have no Godzilla and have that never happen than to have their Godzilla because it happened. But when you ever sit there and you wonder, as we start closing this short podcast deep dive into Godzilla 54, remember that when you ask yourself, why can't America make such a cool monster like Godzilla? Or why can't, why don't we see other countries or other studios make their own monster and make it epic the way Godzilla is and make it a good story and good this? Because it's hard to duplicate a story that's based on something that actually happened. It's hard to duplicate a story that is based on real life trauma and terror. Because you have to experience it to understand how to express it. Whether you want to write about it, whether you do a movie, whether you put something in a journal, graphic novel, a song, doesn't matter. And that's why this movie's so special. That's why it'll always be considered the best kaiju movie ever created, in my opinion. And yes, there were other kaiju movies that were created based on the nuclear tragedy. But what those movies did was try to duplicate what Godzilla did to be successful. And they all failed, not because their projects were any worse or not because they didn't have a good story to tell, but because rather than express their own experience differently, they try to duplicate the experience that was expressed in Godzilla 54, at least in my opinion. So yeah, Godzilla 1954 always will remain number one, in my opinion. Back in the day, I used to kind of have it at number two. But when I first picked up the Blu-ray for Godzilla 1954, I would say, well, that year, in 2014 when I had that discussion with my mom. I hadn't seen the movie in a while, and I wanted to pick up the Blu-ray. And from that day forward, after having that conversation with her, after watching it on Blu-ray, I realized this is just the best Godzilla movie. And when you think about it, when you look at some of the Godzilla movies that have ever been created, some of the best Godzilla movies have been solo movies, have been with him on his own. And you look at today and we look at these Godzilla movies and we complain about the stories and we complain about how much he's in the movie. But the story, the reason this movie works so well, even though he's in this movie far less than most any of his other movies, and even though the stories now we consider either cheesy or not so good, mediocre, think about all the things that had to happen, and think about how all the pieces had to fall into place for Godzilla 54 to be born. And I said this on one of my live streams. I mentioned that you have to, I think for a kaiju movie to be successful, and it doesn't have to happen based on tragedy, you can still make a good, successful kaiju film. But you have to care about it the way these actors and this director did. And obviously they cared extra because of what it represented. But that is the level of care. That is the level of dedication you need to put into a Godzilla, or excuse me, a movie based on kaiju. Because remember, your main character is a monster. So you need to have human characters to tell the story through this monster. And now, to me, it should be something that is a little bit easier to do because you have the special effects now to put expressions on the monster, to make the monster express themselves physically. One of the things I mentioned about Godzilla King of the Monsters that I love is when Godzilla first gets to Antarctica to engage with Ghidorah, they pan up and you can see in his face, he looks at Ghidorah and it clearly is him saying, "Oh, it's you again." You can see that in his expression. Obviously, we don't know what he's thinking, but I mean, you get an idea of what he's thinking. What I'm saying is you never know what he might say. He could be saying, "Oh, it's you again." Oh, the point is he is making an expression towards Ghidorah that is in disregard, that this doesn't like what he's saying. And that was a great part for me because you could insert whatever it is you think he might be saying at that moment. But one thing is guaranteed. It has to do with Ghidorah. But for Hollywood or even Japan, even Toho, for them to make another successful Godzilla film, they have to put the level of care, and more so Hollywood. I'm not really, because obviously Toho put a lot of care into Shin Gojira. As I said, there's just some directions I didn't agree with, especially with the laser light show. But in terms of his design and his destruction, Shin Gojira is really, I still say to this day, his atomic breath scene is one of the best atomic breath scenes in any Godzilla movie. Probably the best bar none. And that's with the fact that I don't like the back laser light show and the laser coming out of his tail. But that moment that he's standing at the center of the city and he starts retracting his jaw and ready to blow atomic breath, it is the best atomic breath scene in any Godzilla movie. Will we ever get a Godzilla 54 or a movie or a kaiju movie similar? I don't think so. But that doesn't mean we won't get or shouldn't get a good kaiju film. And to have a good kaiju film, I think it takes time. I think the director needs to take his time. I think the actors need to put their all into it because the actors have to do extra. They got to carry their own load, but they also got to carry the load of the fictional character that's being represented because that fictional character cannot talk. That fictional character is supposed to entice fear and misunderstanding, And the characters have to express that through their reaction to what they're seeing on screen or what they're seeing in front of them, which 9 times out of 10, there's nothing there. And it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of good actors out there that can do it. But 1954, still the best Godzilla movie. I don't think we'll ever see anything like it again. I think it still holds up to this day. And while we may never get to experience it like those back in the 50s that got to see it, or like my mother who expressed how it gave her nightmares, which I can understand why. Because I look at this movie, and despite the fact that it may not have that same effect on me, I could see the moments in the movie that are very dreadful, scary, and could bring a lot of despair. And imagine how that makes you feel watching it. And then you stop and think, imagine how these people felt going through that for 15 years from the time of Hiroshima, or rather 11 years between the time of Hiroshima and the release of this movie. 9 years, because it was 45 to 54 was when it came out. So yes, Godzilla 1954 is the best Godzilla movie, bar none, for many, many reasons. I don't think a movie will ever be created to match it in terms of the kaiju genre. And I think there are a lot of elements that went into it that you'll never, ever be able to duplicate. I hope we don't ever get to duplicate that. And because of that trauma, that experience, and all those stories and all those people who had to experience such a horrific tragedy, that's why we got Godzilla. And in terms of this particular movie, we'll probably never get something like to its effect again in the kaiju genre. So with that said, I want to know what you guys think of Godzilla 1954. Do you see it that way? When you go in, you see the movie, it's very common for people to say it represents, the nuclear power, but it represents so much more than that. It really does. And I just kind of want to know what you guys think. Next deep dive we'll do Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla. Since I mentioned it on the podcast, that'll be an episode that we'll do, and we'll do that one next Monday. And if you have a particular Godzilla movie that you want me to cover in the deep dive series, let me know. You can either call in to the show and leave a message. You can send an email to etnpodcast@gmail.com, or leave a comment in the section of this video, as I am putting this podcast up on the channel in its entirety, including the video portion that you're watching now. But not all the deep dive episodes will be on the channel, so keep that in mind. But you guys know where to find the podcast. And until the next episode, this is Rob signing off for E.T.N. Well, I guess since we're doing a podcast, I should probably do that differently. But take it easy, guys.
Thank you for listening to Entertainment Talk
and
Nation.
We'll see you next time.
Don't forget to rate and follow and visit us on YouTube at E.T.N, where you can subscribe to the channel for daily content.